Well, good afternoon. And I'd first of all like to thank Mr. Norman Wells very much for extending the invitation to come and speak here this afternoon. But I'd also like to thank everybody involved with the Family Education Trust for your faithful, careful, evidence-based work over many, many years to simply tell the truth about the family. The fact that we have to ask the question, what is marriage, would have seemed absolutely ridiculous, wouldn't it, 50 years ago? Because in law, in society and in culture, there was really a shared understanding that marriage was the union of one man and one woman voluntarily entered into for life to the exclusion of all others. But we stand now, I believe, at a crossroads. Some of you may recall that in that Greek tragedy Oedipus, when Antigone was forbidden to bury the body of her brother, she defied the king because he had no right to meddle with what were described there as the unwritten...
No, you need to just be right close to it, that's it. Sorry.
The unwritten and unfailing laws, not of now, not of yesterday. They always live, and no one knows their origins in time. And many people today suspect that with regard to marriage, as a society, we too are now meddling with those unwritten and unfailing laws. And this afternoon I'm just going to address three questions. Firstly, what is marriage? Secondly, how has our society's understanding of marriage changed? And thirdly, how has this revised understanding of marriage worked out in practice? What have the results been? Before I go to that first question, is this okay now?
Yeah.
Are you okay?
Yep.
All right.
Excellent, thank you.
Okay, turning to our first question, what is marriage? Marriage, I would argue, is a natural institution. It isn't the creation of lawyers, it predates our legal system, it isn't the creation of government, it predates our nation. And it's not the creation of the church. It goes back long before the Christian church, indeed back to the beginning of recorded history. Of course, the way it's celebrated and been regulated has changed through time, but the central man-woman element has not changed. It's not a social or legal or religious construct that we can mess around with as we please. It's an institution which is rooted right in human nature. And from the beginning of time, marriage has brought together man and woman into that complementary union which joins the two different sexes. It's that man-woman union which alone naturally produces new life. Now, of course, some married couples don't have children. But that's always been the case, and that's never before undermined the common and universal understanding of the public good of marriage. Across the globe and across the millennia, the same bedrock features have characterized the family. Some form of marriage to legitimize the sexual union, and a taken for granted acceptance that the core function of that union revolves around procreation and protection of children. Now, of course, homosexuality has always existed in human societies, and sometimes it's been recognised as a social norm. For example, in ancient Athens, man-boy relationships were very common, but they were not confused with marriage. Some people you hear today citing a few examples from ancient Rome. For example, Nero's so-called marriage to two men being the most famous, but these were actually isolated cases of parodying the universally recognised institution of man-woman marriage. There have been some instances through history of recognising same-sex unions, but they have never been equated with the institution of man-woman marriage. Sometimes, for example, in some cultures, a male or female role has been played by someone of the opposite gender, as with some North American Indian two-spirit tradition tribes. Another very rare exception is the Nuers of Sudan, who sometimes permitted a wealthy, childless, older woman to partner economically, socially, with a younger woman whose children would be her heirs. But those exceptions are repeatedly, tiresomely, cited as historical examples of same-sex marriage, and they are not. Some of you may have heard of a theologian called John Boswell, whose book is being very regularly wheeled out at the moment, who claimed that the early church recognised same-sex marriage, but that, I tell you, is not true either. Close relationships called brotherhood or sisterhood were understood to be intimate spiritual unions. But they were not recognised as sexual unions, still less marriages. And in fact, interestingly, the Greek Orthodox Church still acknowledges such unions. And one American female professor, Robin Young, went off to a Greek monastery with a close female friend to vow a union. And she explains from first-hand experience just how wrong it is to equate those sacred spiritual unions with marriage. There have been same-sex unions in the past, but not same-sex marriages. Marriage is a natural institution found across time and across cultures. But that means that marriage is bigger than just the two people involved. From the beginning of recorded history, marriage has been about more than just the partners because it brings together two kinship groups. Any children born to the union have a genealogy of ancestors from both father and mother. Marriage is what links past generations to future generations. It's the building block of society, aiding the flow of care and support between the generations. One of the very earliest law codes known to us today was written by a king in Mesopotamia in about the year 2000 BC. And a full third of his law code was about marriage. And his proud boast was, quote, "I made the father stand by their children. I made the children stand by their father." In other words, mothers generally are there and stay around to care for their children. But fathers are not so likely to, unless they commit to the mother of their child in marriage. Marriage, moreover, involves the two people taking vows, solemn vows before witnesses that they will remain together till death us do part, because those lifelong family units provide ongoing care for family members, and they're often strong enough to extend care outwards to others as well. In other words, they provide that wider family network, also providing care in some cases to the community, providing social capital. That demand for permanence, till death us do part, has historically attempted to secure lifelong care from both parents that children need and deserve. That's why, historically, governments have regulated marriage. It's the most effective way of seeking to ensure that a child is cared for by its own mother and father. Many of you will be very aware that the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of the Child says that every child has the right, where possible, to know and be brought up by his or her own natural parents. Now, of course, death or divorce may prevent that. And of course, there are single parents doing a fantastic job. And of course, in some cases, children have to be adopted. But none of that changes the fact that ideally, every child deserves the love of its own mother and its own father. Through time, societies have sought to regulate marriage, not because governments are involved in emotional and romantic relationships, but because children are vulnerable. They can't look after themselves. They actually, as many of you are very aware, take years and years and years to rear to the point of independence. Now, at any one moment in this country, there are around 65,000 children so-called in care. And effectively, the state takes responsibility for those children. And at the age of 16, a young person is presented with an advisor and a pathway plan. Yes, on a physical level, a basic level, they can fend for themselves. But we all know there's something missing, something terribly important. In contrast, when a young person does have his or her own mum and dad working as a team to support that young person right into adulthood, that is almost invariably, not always, but almost invariably, the gift society gives them via the institution of marriage. Marriage is about more than the two people involved. Lifelong marriages are good for the children, good for extended families, good for communities, and good for society. But because of those wider implications and responsibilities, marriage entails rules and obligations. When they marry, the couple promise to be faithful to each other for life. There has to be sexual exclusivity, and the flip side of rules and obligations is penalty and stigma for breaking them. And it's for that reason that the family became the target of hostility from those engaged in the sexual liberation movement. Marriage was seen as closing down your options, ending your freedom, and in more academic jargon, the ultimate in sexual negativity. In other words, you could henceforth only have sex with one person. And the final integral element of real marriage is that marriage is a gendered institution. Only the complementary union of man and woman can naturally give rise to new life. And so marriage as a gendered union, a sexual union, is a union joining two lives. And that includes property and possessions, yes, but it also includes bodily or conjugal union. A marriage which is unconsummated can therefore be annulled, and sexual infidelity or adultery can be cited as a ground for divorce. So marriage is a natural institution. It's bigger than the two people involved. It entails rules and obligations, and it's a gendered institution. Now, I just want to say a very few words about how the state upheld this view of marriage up to around the 1960s. Until 1969, if one marriage partner wanted a divorce, it was difficult to do so without the consent of the other partner. When divorce was granted, there was an assumption that at least one partner would have to admit some kind of fault. And also up until the 1960s, public policy discouraged having children outside of marriage. Much could be said about this, but just suffice to say that when the welfare state was founded, the consensus was that children should be brought up within marriage. The Beveridge Report of 1942 was framed around the assumption that the great majority of people would marry and that husbands would provide financially for their children. And benefits under that scheme could not be paid to women who were living with men to whom they were not married. And until the 1960s, the number of children born outside wedlock stayed fairly level at around 5% or no more a year. But we turn now to the second question this afternoon. From that, if you like, traditional understanding of what marriage is, natural, bigger than the two people involved, involving rules and gendered, how has our understanding of marriage changed? Now, over the last half century or so, the understanding of what marriage is all about has shifted, because radical individualism has meant that marriage is now often understood as being primarily about the emotional satisfaction of the two partners involved. Therefore, the norms regulating it have been loosened accordingly. Academics describe this process as the de-institutionalisation of marriage. But our Prime Minister, Mr. Cameron, puts it much more simply when he just says, well, marriage, it's just about love and commitment. By the second half of the 20th century, the nuclear family, or even more disparagingly, the bourgeois family, had fallen out of fashion among intellectuals. Universities taught psychologists, social workers, health workers and educationists to regard it as the seedbed of psychiatric dysfunction, the likely location of abuse, the place where children were victims of either over-controlling or over-indulgent parents, take your pick, and where children were kept in economic dependence on their overbearing husbands. Radical feminists believed that the married family was really at the root of patriarchy, which of course, as we all know, is the source of all evils. So sociologists rejected the idea of the married family as natural, claiming that it's a purely social construct and therefore one that can be changed exactly as we wish. They celebrated the advent of families of choice, and they promoted the idea that family can, of course, be any group of people who live together and care for each other. In the words of one sociologist, the old stereotype of families based on marriage and blood ties has been replaced by a rich diversity and complex variety of arrangements for family life. Families now are fluid networks based on ties of affection, flexible rather than institutionalised. Academics, sociologists, policymakers and gay rights campaigners have said that family structure doesn't matter for children as much as love and commitment. Now, of course, the notion of individual freedom is central to Western society, and taken to an extreme, the logical outcome of the elevation of personal freedom above all other goods means that we're to be free to come and go as we want in our relationships. If each individual has the absolute right, nay, duty, to fulfil themselves, this releases them from binding obligations to others. Some of you may remember Anthony Giddens, Lord Giddens now, advisor on family matters to Tony Blair when New Labour was in power. Now, Anthony Giddens describes this process as the extension of democracy into the arena of relationships and emotions. Some of you may have read his key text, The Transformation of Intimacy, published in 1992. And in The Transformation of Intimacy, he analysed relationships in modern democratic societies, and he says it's no longer right to imprison people in relationships which are hedged around by social or legal obligations. A pure relationship is one where a person is free to leave at any point. They shouldn't be bound by promise or duty, because as soon as obligation enters into a relationship, it's compromised, it's no longer free, and it's no longer pure. So, if your heart tells you that your soulmate is someone other than your marriage partner, then you owe it to yourself to follow your heart. The Hollywood myth of romance has fed the expectation that somewhere out there is the perfect relationship which will fulfill our every need. If my current relationship doesn't live up, I should move on. And if my soulmate is somebody of the same gender, why shouldn't I marry that person? So invariably, in a democracy of the emotions, the binding norms and obligations attached to traditional marriage have to be loosened. Partners shouldn't be bound by the promises they've made to be faithful to each other, because such promises, it is thought, poison the relationship, trapping the partners in a locked room without a key. Past societies protected the institution of marriage because they had an interest in protecting the legitimacy of children. But this meant, in some cases, overriding the personal desires of adults. But we're no longer willing to deny anyone's personal desires. We've grown up as a society. Our ideal, as Giddens says, is confluent relationships. Confluent relationships, in case you hadn't noticed, are relationships where you're free to stay or free to go. Moreover, we're free to choose our sexuality, free to choose our gender, free to choose whether to reproduce or not, with or without a resident partner. For those who do choose to marry, exit is made possible by means of very easily accessible divorce, and we can move on to a more satisfying partnership. Marriage is no longer till death us do part. If individual satisfaction is what counts, then it's no longer necessarily between a man or a woman either. Now, in any particular case, I agree and I accept that it may well be true that greater individual freedom has led to happiness, and it's easier now than it was in the past to leave abusive relationships, which is a good thing. But there is a price tag to all this freedom, and that price tag is chronic insecurity. Because now, when you wake up in the morning, actually, you never ever know whether your partner will still be there. He or she may have decided to leave for somebody younger, cleverer, richer, more attractive, or just somebody new. The pure relationship is by definition chronically insecure. Radical feminists decried the idea of sex roles, and we've been brought up with the assumption that men and women are completely interchangeable. So we've been told for years it just doesn't matter for children whether they're brought up in a two-parent heterosexual family or in a one-parent family or with a gay or lesbian couple. And the call for same-sex marriage is therefore part of a much broader agenda, the challenge to all gender distinctions. Some argue now that to divide humanity into two genders, male and female, is a deeply oppressive thing to do. And we notice that those countries that have introduced same-sex marriage have had to rewrite their legal systems completely to eliminate gender distinctions because they are deemed to be oppressive and discriminatory. In Spain, for example, birth certificates have replaced father and mother with gender-neutral language, which is much kinder and more sympathetic, progenitor A and progenitor B. Now, I want to outline now how since around 1960, the state has effectively rubber-stamped and endorsed this new deinstitutionalised understanding of marriage. In the interests of gender freedom and greater freedom, the 20th century saw the state embracing and promoting the values and ideals of the permissive sexual revolution and loosening all of the norms and obligations which had previously served to support the married family. The first major norm to be challenged was, of course, the idea that sex should generally be linked with marriage. And this was made possible by the newly available contraceptive pill, which facilitated the breaking of the link between sexual intercourse and procreation. And so from 1974 onwards, the state was providing contraceptive advice and supplies to all, whether married or not, whether above the age of consent or not, with or without parental consent, and free of charge. That was all in place by 1974. And this provision was actively promoted by means of sex education programs in schools. The Abortion Act of 1967 had facilitated the breaking of the link between, or the breaking of the link which had previously largely restricted sexual activity to marriage. And this breaking of the link between sex and marriage characterised the 1960s and 1970s and policy in the 1960s and 1970s. State provision of contraception and abortion contributed to a whole sea change in attitude and behaviour. And increasingly there was no stigma and no shame associated with sexual activity outside of marriage. But the next major norm to be challenged was the norm of marital parliaments. The Divorce Reform Act of 1969 allowed divorce on the grounds of, quote, irretrievable breakdown, which of course is a purely subjective standard. And then divorce was made quicker and easier by subsequent acts in 1973, 1984 and 1996. And the sum effect of that, divorces have gone up from 25,000 roughly a year back in the early 1960s to 150,000 in 1999 and going up. The next norm to collapse was the expectation of marrying before living together and of marrying before having children. Cohabitation became increasingly acceptable, and the government now does not distinguish in policy terms between cohabiting and married couples. In 1982, the position of children born inside and outside of marriage was equalised, and in 1987, the Family Law Act abolished the status of illegitimacy. Successive governments, both Labour and Conservative, as you will have noticed, have raised the taxes paid by married working parents with children while at the same time increasing benefits paid to lone parents. And after New Labour came to power in 1997, the married couples allowance, which was the only remaining recognition of marriage in the tax system, was abolished, except for more senior couples. So by 2001, official statistics made no distinction between married and cohabiting couples, conflating them into the single category, couple families. For tax purposes, people are treated as individuals, and marital status is not taken into account. But when benefits are assessed, household circumstances have to be declared. And declaring a relationship, whether it's married, cohabiting or civil partnership, is likely to compromise and reduce benefits available. So what's the result of that? Well, by 2005, it was estimated 1.2 million couples living apart, living together. Non-residential cohabitation. That simply means that they have to conceal their relationships from officialdom. And self-evidently, it's easier to conceal a relationship if it's not been formalised by marriage. And therefore, at the lowest income levels, sort of people I work with, marriage has often disappeared, almost a vanishing point. You just can't do it. The charity CARE has done brilliant and detailed work documenting the way that 3/4 of couples with a combined income of less than £45,000 a year would on average be better off by about £45 a week if they split up. In other words, the people that I meet and work with at the lower income level are making a totally irrational choice if they get married. Some will lose housing, some will lose benefits. So in 2007, in Knowsley, just outside of Liverpool, 68.5% of children were born outside of marriage. In Hartlepool, it was 68%. In Hull, it was 67%. And in Blackpool, it was 66.9%. Okay, now just contrast that. Compare this with Harrow, where number of children born outside of marriage in the same year was 21.5%. St Albans, 22.9%. Kensington and Chelsea, 23.6%. Well, these stark discrepancies simply underline the invidious nature of the so-called couple penalty. It's the poorer people who are affected. Our Prime Minister, Mr Cameron, says that he's a great supporter of marriage. Well, he may be a great supporter of marriage for families like his, with a combined income of well over £45,000 a year. He just doesn't seem to be able to fathom that for ordinary couples with less or much, much less than that, there are financial disincentives which often make marriage a completely unattainable dream. The state has also endorsed the idea that gender is a purely social construct and that gendered parenthood is optional. I'll simply mention the 2008 Human Fertilisation and Embryology Act, which ruled that when a lesbian in a civil partnership has a child, then her partner can be placed on the birth certificate as the second parent. And that in that case, quote, this is quoting the Act, no man is to be regarded as the father of that child, end quote. And the 2008 HFE Act also removed the clause which had been included in the previous 1990 HFE Act, which had stated in 1990 that account should be taken, quote, of the welfare of the child who may be born as a result of the treatment, including the need of that child for a father. But by 2008, it was the government's view that fathers were no longer needed. So to summarise this first two sections, the old understanding was that marriage is a natural institution. The new understanding? No. Marriage is a purely social construct to be reshaped as we will. The old understanding? Marriage is bigger than the two people involved. It joins past generations with future generations, and it joins together two extended families. The new understanding, promoted by Hollywood and the media? No. Marriage is all about individual happiness, love and commitment. The old understanding? Marriage is the union of a man and a woman. No. New understanding? Gender categories are just a social construct. Irrelevance marriage, which is about the happiness of two individuals, whatever their actual assumed or apparent gender. The old understanding? Marriage involves rules and obligations. New understanding? No. Rules and obligations must be dismantled if they impinge on our personal fulfilment. Up to around 1960, the state endorsed and promoted the old understanding of marriage. Since around 1960, the state has endorsed and promoted the new understanding of marriage. And within the terms of the new revised understanding of marriage, arguments for same-sex marriage make perfect sense. Because if marriage is all about individual commitment and individual fulfilment, then it seems absolutely outrageous to deny gay and lesbian couples the human and social happiness that would flow from being allowed to join in. If gender is an artificial social construct, and marriage and parenthood aren't necessarily gendered institutions, then it seems unjust and unfair to deny same-sex couples the right to marry. So, the government's marriage (same-sex couples bill was presented to Parliament on the 24th of January 2013, and it was voted for by a majority of MPs after the second reading debate on the 5th of February. And if it passes into law, this bill will redefine marriage by removing the central understanding that marriage is and can only be the union of a man and a woman. Because as soon as one same-sex couple is recognised in law as married, then marriage itself has to be understood by everyone and for everyone as an institution having nothing to do with gender. This, I would suggest, is the logical last piece of the jigsaw of the new, revised, deinstitutionalised understanding of marriage. Mr. Cameron regards himself as on the right side of history as he holds this final piece of the jigsaw. But I'd like us just to pause and look at the nearly completed jigsaw. Only time will fully reveal the outworkings of this radically revised understanding of marriage. But what does the evidence suggest to date? Bluntly, has it worked? So this is our third and final section, the revised understanding of marriage in practice. Well, the first major result of the deinstitutionalisation of marriage has been that far greater numbers of children grow up apart from one natural parent. So in 1961 in Britain, 6.3% of children that year were born outside of marriage. And 50 years later, in 2011, 47.2% of children were born outside of marriage. By the beginning of this new millennium, the total number of marriages, including remarriages, had dropped by 40% since the early 1970s. We've already mentioned the increased divorce rate, up from about 25,000 in 1961 to more than 150,000 in 1999. But then a major societal change has been the increase of children born to people in cohabiting relationships, but then the tendency of such relationships to break up, leaving the mother as a lone parent. And all of this contributes to the fact that by 2004, 3.75 million children were living apart from one of their natural parents. Last year, 2012, there were nearly 2 million lone parents with dependent children, and this year, 2013, it was reckoned that only 55% of 15-year-olds will live with both natural parents, or are living with both natural parents. Now, it's difficult to say, but as far as society is concerned, this is actually very uncharted territory. Historically, we've never seen such high numbers of children, particularly children growing up without a father. So it's pretty well uncharted territory. But during the coming decades, what do we expect? Well, we would expect that the state will be expected to move in to take an ever greater responsibility for not only provision and care for the young, but also for the ill and for the elderly. And this means that so-called adult-free choices, living out the pure relationship, living out the dream, don't just affect the individual adults involved, because when a baby is born, either the parents of that baby care for it, or somebody else has to, somebody else being usually government. And so in 2011, the Jubilee Foundation in Cambridge produced a very sobering impact assessment of the cost to the taxpayer of sexual permissiveness and family breakdown. And they reckon that on average, every working person pays £700 a year to help pick up the tab for absent fathers in those younger years particularly. And the report concludes, the costs of sexual freedom and relationship breakdown to the taxpayer and wider economy are complex and difficult to calculate, but £100 billion annually is probably a reasonable starting point, about twice as much as alcohol, obesity and smoking combined. But of course the human cost is less easily quantifiable. Some of you may have read books by the psychologist and author Oliver James, and Oliver James has noted that in this country we haven't lived through any major wars since 1950, but during that time, he says, we've been losing each other so frequently that it's, in emotional terms, as if we've lived through a psychological Third World War. And he writes, the increased emotional and physical separation of child from parent, of lover from lover, and of elderly parent from relative is a wail of anguish which crescendos to the farthest reaches of our society. The epidemic of broken bonds is so damaging because we form more intense, intimate relationships than hitherto only to break them. Divorce does have many similar psychological consequences to bereavement, and since 1950 there have been more than 2.5 million divorces in Britain. And what's hit me most over the past 30 years or so in both teaching and family support work has been the impact of this relationship breakdown, particularly on children. And I was pretty shocked and saddened to see that a survey of children's Christmas wish lists in December 2012 revealed that many little children are now asking simply for a dad. But perhaps one of the most worrying effects of the deinstitutionalisation of marriage in our society, I believe, has been the deepening of division in our society. Back in 1845, Benjamin Disraeli wrote Sybil, a novel better known by its subtitle, The Two Nations. And Disraeli described the dire poverty of the working classes during the Hungry 40s, the 1840s, and contrasted their lot with the lavish lifestyle of the aristocracy. And he spoke of two nations who are as ignorant of each other's habits, thoughts and feelings as though they were dwellers in different zones or inhabitants of different planets. The two nations, of course, were the rich and the poor. 1.5 centuries after Sybil was published, in December 2006, Breakdown Britain was published, the findings of a 3-year study into social breakdown led by Ian Duncan Smith. And it brought a wealth of evidence to show that family breakdown lay behind the emergence of an entrenched underclass characterised by crime, drugs, debt, alcohol abuse and lack of achievement. And so today, two nations still do exist in Britain. The media is controlled by one nation, and this nation is protected to some degree by education and relative wealth from the fallout of the sexual revolution and the deinstitutionalisation of the married family. And many of the people in this nation are still living off the memory of a Christian culture anyway. And all of us here today in this richer nation have friends and relatives who are decent, caring and responsible lone parents, and some of us are decent, responsible and caring lone parents ourselves. We've been shielded from the full effects of the deinstitutionalisation of marriage. But the new loosening of the norms regulating marriage has worked out in a far more brutal way and a far more destructive way among the poorest of our nation. They suffer the most. Successive governments have been ploughing huge amounts of money into attempting to tackle child poverty, but they have failed utterly to grasp that it's family breakdown which lies at the root of so many of the issues surrounding child poverty. And worst of all, they seem utterly incapable of understanding that the state-enforced couple penalty hits those at the lower income levels disproportionately hard. The way the tax and benefit system mesh together means in effect that our government is penalising family stability and rewarding relationship breakdown. You may have read the books and columns written by Theodore Dalrymple, pen name for Anthony Daniels, who worked for many years in Birmingham, I believe, as a doctor in a slum area and also as a prison doctor and psychiatrist. And he claims to have interviewed some 10,000 people, each of whom told him about the lives of several others around them. And he claims thus to have learned firsthand about the lives of some 50,000 people in this other nation, which is not the nation we live in, but it is here in Britain. He says these people's lives were dominated by violence, crime and degradation. He claims to have seen countless women and children who have suffered dreadful abuse, and he blames the radical individualism expressed in the sexual revolution and the subsequent dismantling of the norms surrounding traditional marriage. And he writes, intellectuals in the 20th century sought to free our sexual relations of all social, contractual or moral obligations and meaning whatsoever, so that, henceforth, only raw sexual desire itself would count in our decision making. If anyone wants to see what sexual relations are like, freed of contractual and social obligations, let him look at the personal lives of members of the underclass. Here are children who have children in numbers unknown before the advent of chemical contraception and sex ed. women abandoned by the father of their child a month before or a month after delivery. Insensate jealousy, the reverse of the coin of general promiscuity, that results in the most horrible oppression and violence. Serial stepfatherhood that leads to sexual and physical abuse of children on a mass scale. And every kind of loosening of the distinction between the sexually permissible and impermissible. You know, loosening marital rules and restrictions were supposed to liberate women from the so-called oppression of traditional marriage. But among the very poorest, marriage has all but disappeared now, replaced by chaotic serial relationships in which it's women and children who are often suffering more violence than ever before. We have lived through 50 years of a massive social experiment. The old understanding of marriage as a natural, gendered institution, bigger than the individuals concerned, mainly about providing ongoing care for children, and of necessity supported by norms and obligations, has been thrown out. Now, it's mainly the well-off who marry, and either party can, whenever they want, end the marriage at will, leaving most of those at the lower income levels to navigate personal relationships without even the admittedly less than permanent protection of marriage. And more than 3.5 million children are going to bed every night without one of their natural parents. Now that's what the jigsaw of the deinstitutionalisation of marriage is looking like at the moment. And do we really want to put in the final piece? So, in conclusion, if we accept the new understanding of marriage, that it's just a social construct to be changed at will, that it's just about the happiness of the individual adults concerned, that gender is merely a social construct, and that we're better off without the old restrictive rules, then we should say yes to gay marriage. It would be hypocritical to do anything else. But I would suggest that the truth is that marriage is a natural institution, that it's bigger than the two people involved. The fact that we are men and women is an objective reality, and if marriage means anything at all, it must involve norms of exclusivity and fidelity. And we should campaign for those norms to be restored and then upheld by government, and we should do so for the sake of the children, who are the most vulnerable members of our society and therefore the most deserving of our care. And I would suggest that gay and lesbian couples can be respected and afforded full civil, legal and practical rights to civil partnerships, as is already the case. But marriage is the union of a man and a woman, and there are gay people who strongly affirm this. For example, and I could give you many examples, but for example, gay academic and journalist Richard Waghorn is adamantly opposed to same-sex marriage, precisely because he rejects the new individualistic view of marriage and he values man-woman marriage as the building block joining the generations. And so he writes, treating different situations differently in no way constitutes discrimination. Altering the focus of marriage from children to relationship disadvantages future generations. Now, the new view, the deinstitutionalised view of marriage, seems so firmly entrenched now in academia, in the media, in the entertainment industry and in government policy that it seems increasingly dangerous to dissent. But look at the evidence around us. Has the new view of marriage delivered greater happiness? Is it working? We can already see just a little of the misery caused by the outworking of radical individualism and the new, more flexible view of marriage. It isn't working, it won't work, and it can't work. So we need to tell the truth about marriage. Antigone defied the king and his laws and risked all to bury her brother, because nobody had the right to make her deny the ancient and fixed laws of our created humanity. And if at this time, and on this issue of marriage, we deny the ancient and fixed truths of our created humanity, we are being untrue to ourselves, untrue to our Creator, and we are betraying the next generation. Thank you very much.